This presentation details a criminal act of destruction and explores controversial theories. Viewer discretion is advised. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 6, 2022, a sound like thunder ripped through the quiet farmland of Elbert County, Georgia. It wasn't a storm. At 4:03 a.m., a surveillance camera captured a flash of light, a cloud of dust, and then chaos. A powerful explosive device had been detonated at the base of one of America's most bizarre and controversial monuments. For over 40 years, it had stood on a lonely hill, a granite enigma known as the Georgia Guidestones. By the time the sun rose, one of its massive stone slabs lay in rubble. Hours later, for safety reasons, authorities would demolish what was left. In a single day, a 4-decade-old mystery wasn't solved. It was violently erased. But the question isn't just who blew it up. The real question is why it was built in the first place. This monument wasn't an ancient relic. It was built in 1980, and etched into its 4 colossal granite slabs, in 8 different modern languages, was a set of 10 cryptic instructions for humanity, a new 10 commandments for a coming age of reason. And the very first one was the most chilling of all. Maintain humanity under 500 million in a perpetual balance with nature. To put that in perspective, the world population in 1980 was over 4.5 billion. Today it's over 8 billion. The very first line on this monument, erected in the heart of America, seemed to call for the elimination of more than 90% of the people on Earth. The other commands were just as strange. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. Unite humanity with a living new language. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. To its critics, this wasn't a guide. It was the manifesto for a new world order, a blueprint for eugenics, population control, and a one-world government. To its few defenders, it was a practical warning, a desperate plea for survival in the event of a nuclear war or a global catastrophe. But for everyone, the Guidestones were a magnet for speculation, because the man who paid for them, the man who designed them, did not exist. His identity remains the central mystery that fueled 40 years of conspiracy and likely led to the monument's violent end. To understand who would want to destroy this message, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to uncover the identity of the ghost who came to Georgia with a strange vision and a briefcase full of cash. Our story begins in June of 1979, in the small, unassuming town of Elberton, Georgia. Elberton calls itself the granite capital of the world, and for good reason. The town sits on a massive deposit of some of the finest granite on the planet. If you wanted to build something out of stone that would last for centuries, Elberton was the place to go. And one Friday afternoon, a man walked into the offices of the Elberton Granite Finishing Company. He was tall, well-dressed, and impeccably articulate. He introduced himself as Robert C. Christian. He told the company president, Joe Fendley, that he represented a small group of loyal Americans living outside of Georgia who wanted to commission a monument. An unusual monument. He didn't just want a statue or a headstone. He wanted an enormous, astronomically aligned granite calendar and clock. He had a shoebox with a detailed wooden model inside, explaining his vision. It would consist of 4 massive upright slabs, fanned out to track the limits of the moon's migration over the course of a year. A central pillar would have a hole drilled through it to align with the North Star, Polaris. Another slot would be cut to align with the sun's solstices and equinoxes. He wanted to build an American Stonehenge. Findley, a practical businessman, was stunned. The sheer scale was mind-boggling. The stones Christian described were larger than any that had ever been quarried in Elberton. The logistics, the cost, the engineering, it all seemed impossible. He thought the man was a kook. To get rid of him, Fendley quoted him a price that was, in his own words, many times higher than any project he had ever done. He expected R.C. Christian to laugh and walk out. Instead, the man didn't even flinch. He simply asked where the nearest bank was. This is where the story deepens from strange to truly mysterious. Fendley sent Christian down the street to see Wyatt Martin, the president of the Granite City Bank. Martin was the town's most respected citizen, a man known for his integrity and his no-nonsense attitude. He sat and listened as this stranger, R.C. Christian, laid out the same incredible plan. Christian explained that his real name was a pseudonym. It was a tribute to his Christian faith, but he refused to reveal his true identity. He said the group he represented had been planning this project for over 20 years and wanted to remain anonymous forever. Wyatt Martin was a banker. He was used to dealing with facts and figures, not secret societies and pseudonyms. He told Christian that he couldn't do business with a ghost. He needed a real name, real credentials for a project of this magnitude. He needed to know that the money was legitimate. Christian's response was simple. He said he would return in a week, and he would prove his sincerity. 1 week later, R.C. Christian walked back into Wyatt Martin's office. He had a briefcase with him. He opened it, revealing tens of thousands of dollars in cash, the substantial down payment for the project. He then made Martin an offer. He said he would tell Martin his true name and provide personal information, but only if Martin swore an oath of absolute secrecy. He had to sign a confidentiality agreement, promising that he would never, under any circumstances, reveal Christian's identity or the identity of his group to anyone. As part of the deal, Martin was to be the sole intermediary for the project. All funds would pass through him. All communications would be directed to him. And when the project was complete, all sketches, plans, and documents were to be destroyed. Wyatt Martin was faced with a choice. He could refuse and this bizarre, potentially historic project would vanish. Or he could agree, becoming the gatekeeper to one of America's greatest modern mysteries. He looked at the man, the money, and the sheer audacity of the plan. He agreed. He signed the documents and took the oath. R.C. Christian revealed his true identity, and for the next 40 years, until his death in 2021, Wyatt Martin kept his promise. He took the secret to his grave. The construction began. The project that seemed impossible became a reality. Quarrying the colossal slabs of pyramid blue granite pushed the local industry to its limits. Craftsmen worked for months, sandblasting the 10 guidelines onto the stones in languages from English and Spanish to Russian, Hebrew, Arabic, Chinese, Hindi, and Swahili. They chiseled a final, capstone message in 4 ancient languages: Babylonian cuneiform, Classical Greek, Sanskrit, and Egyptian hieroglyphs. The message read, "Let these be guidestones to an age of reason." On March 22, 1980, the Georgia Guidestones were unveiled to a small crowd of a few hundred people. R.C. Christian was not among them. After securing the land and the funds, he vanished as mysteriously as he had arrived. He corresponded with Wyatt Martin by mail for years, sending letters from different cities all across the country, never from the same place twice. He had created his enigma, and then stepped back into the shadows to watch what the world would make of it. And the world was immediately divided. Was this a benevolent guide for a shattered future humanity? A set of common-sense principles for rebuilding civilization? Or was it the sinister plan of a globalist cabal? A public declaration of an intent to commit mass genocide and enslave the survivors? Who was this man R.C. Christian? Was he a prophet? A philosopher? Or was he the spokesman for a powerful and dangerous organization, hiding in plain sight? The stones themselves offered no answers, only more questions. And for 4 decades they stood as a silent testament to a secret that someone was willing to kill for, and ultimately someone was willing to destroy. To understand the fury that would one day bring these stones down, you have to understand what was carved into them. This wasn't just a sculpture. It was a manifesto, a 10-point plan for humanity, etched in 8 different languages, a message for the survivors of a catastrophe that its creators believed was not just possible, but inevitable. And the very first guide, the one that would become the lightning rod for 4 decades of fear and outrage, was a chilling call to action. Maintain humanity under 500 million in a perpetual balance with nature. Let's stop and think about that. In 1980, when the stones were erected, the world population was over 4.5 billion people. Today it's over 8 billion. To get down to 500 million would require the elimination of more than 90% of the people on Earth. Was this a guide for a post-apocalyptic future, a suggestion for the handful of survivors rebuilding society? Or was it a command, a call for a global culling, a depopulation event on a scale that would make every war and plague in human history look like a statistical rounding error? For critics, the answer was obvious. This wasn't a guide for survivors. It was a blueprint for mass murder, published on a granite billboard in rural Georgia. The second guide only amplified these fears. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. To the average person, this sounds terrifyingly close to eugenics, the discredited and monstrous philosophy of selective breeding that fueled the horrors of the Third Reich. Who gets to decide what wise reproduction is? Who determines what fitness means? Is it a government panel? A secret cabal? The same anonymous group that funded these stones? The implication was clear to many. A world where the state controls the most personal decision a human can make, the right to have a family. A future where human beings are bred like livestock. The commands continued, each one peeling back a new layer of a strange, unfamiliar vision for the future. Unite humanity with a living new language. A noble goal on the surface, perhaps, but in the context of the first two guides, it sounded like another tool of control. Erase cultural identity, erase history, and replace it all with a single homogeneous world culture speaking one language, likely ruled by one government. It was the Tower of Babel, not as a cautionary tale from the Bible, but as an instruction manual. Then came the fourth guide, a direct assault on the very foundations of American life, especially in the heart of the Bible Belt where these stones stood. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. To the faithful, this was nothing short of blasphemy. It placed human reason above God. It dismissed faith and tradition, the cornerstones of community, family, and morality for millions, as primitive impulses that needed to be controlled. It was a declaration of war on religion itself. The creators weren't just proposing a new world, they were proposing a new God, the cold, calculating, and to many soulless God of pure logic. The remaining guides sounded more benign, but read in the shadow of the first four, they took on a sinister tone. Protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. Fair enough. But who writes the laws in this new world? Let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. A world court? A one-world government? The conspiracy theories were writing themselves. Avoid petty laws and useless officials. A sentiment many could agree with, but it also hinted at a streamlined, authoritarian system with little room for dissent. Balance personal rights with social duties. This was another red flag. In the United States, personal rights are paramount, inalienable. The idea of balancing them against vague social duties sounded like a recipe for tyranny, where the needs of the collective, as defined by the state, would always crush the rights of the individual. Prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Vague, New Age spirituality that felt alien and unsettling. And finally, the 10th guide, echoing the first, be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. The message was clear, humanity in its current form was a disease, a plague, a cancer, and the Georgia Guidestones were the prescription for the cure. This 10-point plan was more than just a set of suggestions. It was a complete and total rejection of the modern world. It rejected Christianity, nationalism, individual liberty, and the sanctity of human life as we know it. And it was all built on a foundation of fear, the Cold War fear of nuclear annihilation that R.C. Christian had explicitly mentioned. The monument was a message to the survivors of a nuclear holocaust that he and his group believed was imminent. They saw themselves not as villains, but as prophets, providing a rational framework to prevent humanity from ever making the same mistakes again. But the local community didn't see prophets. They saw something dark. Preachers began denouncing the stones from the pulpit, calling them the 10 Commandments of the Antichrist. They pointed to the pagan-like astronomical features of the monument, the central slot that aligned with the celestial pole, the hole drilled through the center stone that focused on the North Star, the slit cut in the capstone that marked the passage of the sun at noon each day. This wasn't just a monument, it was a temple. It was a massive granite sundial, a celestial clock built for a new age of reason, an age without their God. Whispers turned into accusations. The name R.C. Christian was seen as a sick joke, a Rose-Cross Christian, a reference to Rosicrucianism, a secretive spiritual movement dating back to the 17th century. Was this the secret organization R.C. Christian represented? A group dedicated to esoteric knowledge and world transformation? Or was it something even more sinister? The stones became a pilgrimage site, not for New Age thinkers, but for a growing movement of conspiracy theorists, Christian fundamentalists, and patriots who saw the monument as a brazen declaration of intent by a shadowy cabal they called the New World Order. They believed the Guidestones were an open-air confession, a plan hidden in plain sight, for a global elite to seize control, eliminate billions of people, and enslave the rest under a single authoritarian world government. Every global crisis, every pandemic, every economic downturn was seen through the lens of the Guidestones' first command. It wasn't just a theory anymore. It was carved in stone, and as the years turned into decades, the anger and suspicion only grew. The monument, intended to be a guide for a future humanity, instead became a symbol of everything people feared about the future. It was a battle line drawn in granite, and the silent stones on that lonely hill in Elbert County were waiting for a war that was destined to come. And that war began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a murmur of unease that rippled through the churches and community halls of Elbert County. At first, the locals were mostly proud of their new strange landmark. It brought tourists, put them on the map. But as the words carved into that granite began to sink in, pride curdled into suspicion, and suspicion into outright hostility. For many devout, church-going people in the heart of the Bible Belt, this was not a guide for humanity. It was a blasphemy. The 10 guides, which R.C. Christian had called the 10 Commandments of the Age of Reason, were seen as a direct, arrogant assault on the actual 10 Commandments. Prize, truth, beauty, love felt like a watered-down, New Age replacement for, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Rule, passion, faith, tradition was interpreted as a command to abandon faith itself. This wasn't a monument to a brighter future. It was a pagan altar erected on Christian soil. Local pastors began preaching against the stones, calling them the work of a sun-worshipping cult, a sinister message from a godless cabal. The whisper was getting louder. The controversy simmered for years, a local dispute fueled by Sunday sermons and letters to the editor. But in the background, a much larger, darker narrative was beginning to take shape, one that had nothing to do with local religious sensibilities and everything to do with global power. People started looking closer at the man behind the curtain, the mysterious R.C. Christian. The pseudonym itself was a clue. R.C. Christian. Christian Rosenkreuz, the legendary founder of the Rosicrucian order, a secretive philosophical society dating back to the 17th century. Was this a connection? A calling card left by a secret society? The Rosicrucians preached a gospel of esoteric knowledge, of a world governed by hidden masters. And suddenly, the Guidestones looked less like a quirky roadside attraction, and more like a public declaration of a hidden agenda. This is where the whispers turned into a roar of conspiracy. The phrase that lit the fuse was, "Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature." To the average person in 1980, the world population was about 4.5 billion. To get down to 500 million, well, you can't do that with birth control alone. That number, carved in stone for all to see, wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. It implied a cataclysm, a culling, a genocide of over 90% of the people on Earth. Who would decide who gets to be part of the 500 million? Who would be deemed worthy to survive? The stones didn't say. And that silence was terrifying. Then came the next guide. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. The word eugenics wasn't carved into the stone, but it might as well have been. It echoed the darkest ideologies of the 20th century, the horrors of selective breeding, of governments deciding who was fit to have children. This wasn't about a peaceful future. This sounded like a blueprint for a dystopia, a world engineered by an unseen elite. And who was this elite? The stones offered more clues. Unite humanity with a living new language. Let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. A single language. A world court. To a growing number of people, this was the unmistakable language of the New World Order. The long-theorized plot by a shadowy cabal of globalists, the Illuminati, the Bilderberg Group, the Council on Foreign Relations, to dissolve national sovereignty, erase individual liberty, and create a single authoritarian world government. The Guidestones were no longer just a local oddity. They were Exhibit A in the case against the global elite. They were a confession, brazenly carved in granite and placed in the middle of a field in rural Georgia. R.C. Christian wasn't just some eccentric rich guy. He was a messenger, an agent of this powerful group, and the stones were their mission statement. They were telling us exactly what they planned to do. For nearly 2 decades, this theory remained on the fringes, shared in newsletters and late-night talk radio shows. But then came the internet, and the firestorm began. The story of America's Stonehenge was perfect for the new digital age of conspiracy. The mystery of R.C. Christian, the creepy, commandment-like guides, the ties to secret societies. It was a ready-made viral narrative. Websites, forums, and nascent video platforms lit up with analysis of the stones. Every detail was scrutinized. The astronomical alignment pointed to paganism and occult rituals. The sheer cost and engineering feat pointed to a group with immense resources and influence. The Guidestones became a pilgrimage site, not just for New Age spiritualists, but for a new breed of investigator: the citizen journalist, the conspiracy researcher, the patriot who saw the stones as a declaration of war on American freedom. They came, they filmed, they documented, and they broadcast their findings to a global audience, amplifying the fear and outrage a millionfold. The monument, built to usher in an age of reason, was now the central symbol for an age of digital paranoia. And with that outrage, the war that had been brewing for so long finally spilled over from the digital world into the physical one. The stones, which had stood silent and untouched for almost 30 years, became a target. In 2008, the first major act of vandalism occurred. The monument was defaced with spray paint. Polyurethane was poured over the granite, but it was the messages that were most telling. Phrases like "Death to the New World Order" were scrawled across the guides. Inversions of Christian messages, accusations of Satanism, anti-globalist slogans. It was a crude, messy, but clear response to the message in the stone. The vandals were never caught, but their actions changed everything. The Guidestones were no longer just a passive symbol. They were an active battleground. The Elbert County authorities installed security cameras, a tacit admission that the monument was under threat. But the attacks continued sporadically over the next decade. Each time the graffiti was cleaned off, the stones restored. But the scars remained, both on the granite and on the public's perception of the monument. Each act of vandalism was a news story, and each news story introduced the Guidestones and their associated conspiracies to a wider audience. The monument's fame grew in lockstep with its infamy. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more people feared it as a symbol of a coming totalitarian world government, the more it became a flashpoint for anti-government sentiment. The silent stones were now screaming with the anger and fear of a generation that felt powerless against forces they couldn't see. The spray paint and petty vandalism were just skirmishes, the first shots fired in the dark. But a new kind of crusader was coming, one who wielded not a spray can, but a camera and a microphone. And he was about to declare an all-out media war on America's Stonehenge. His name was Alex Jones, and in 2008, he released a film that would forever change the destiny of those granite slabs. The film was called Endgame: Blueprint for Global Enslavement, and in it, Jones didn't just visit the Georgia Guidestones, he put them on trial in the court of public opinion. He presented them not as a quirky roadside attraction, but as Exhibit A in a case against a shadowy global elite. To Jones and his rapidly growing audience, the Guidestones were nothing less than the 10 Commandments of the Antichrist. He stood before the monument, his voice a gravelly roar, and translated the 10 guides into a language of pure fear. Suddenly, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature wasn't a post-apocalyptic suggestion. It was a death warrant. It was a public declaration by a sinister cabal, the New World Order, of their intent to exterminate over 95% of the people on Earth. Who would they cull? How would they do it? Through engineered pandemics? Sterilization agents in the water supply? World War III? The ambiguity was the point. It allowed every viewer to fill in the blanks with their deepest anxieties. The Guidestones, he argued, were the elite openly bragging about their genocidal plans. Then came the second guide: Guide Reproduction Wisely, Improving Fitness and Diversity. To the uninitiated, it might sound like benign if vaguely unsettling advice. But through the lens of conspiracy, it became something monstrous. This was eugenics, plain and simple. The same philosophy that fueled the horrors of the Third Reich, now etched in stone in rural Georgia. It was a plan for a master race designed and controlled by the same faceless elites who wanted to wipe out the rest of us. They would decide who was fit to have children, who was diverse enough to be allowed to breed. It was a vision of a human farm, managed by a cold, calculating, and unseen farmer. The other guides were twisted into equally sinister shapes. Unite Humanity with a Living New Language was a blueprint for a one-world government, erasing national sovereignty and cultural identity. Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason was a direct assault on Christianity. It was a command to replace God with a cold, secular, globalist logic. To Jones, this wasn't about balance, it was about submission. The stones were a declaration of war on faith, family, and freedom. But where was the proof? Who were these globalists? This is where the narrative took a crucial turn, zeroing in on the monument's greatest mystery: the identity of R.C. Christian. For years, the name was assumed to be a simple pseudonym, a nod to the founder of a Christian faith. But conspiracy theorists, most notably a man named Mark Dice, proposed a different reading. They argued R.C. didn't stand for Robert C. It stood for Rose Cross. R.C. Christian was Rosicrucian. Suddenly, a hidden key seemed to unlock everything. Rosicrucianism, a mystical secret society dating back to the 17th century, was immediately linked to a whole constellation of other shadowy groups: Freemasons, the Illuminati, Skull and Bones. These were the secret fraternities that, in the world of conspiracy, pull the strings of power. They were the architects of the New World Order. And according to this theory, they had built a monument to their dark faith, hiding their identity in plain sight. The name Christian wasn't a profession of faith. It was a mockery of it, a clever disguise for a Luciferian doctrine. This one idea, that R.C. Christian was a Rosicrucian, was the spark that lit the bonfire. It transformed the monument from a political statement into a spiritual one. It was no longer just a plan for a secular world government. It was a satanic altar, a place of unholy pilgrimage. The hole drilled through the center stone, aligned with the North Star, was no longer a clever astronomical feature. It was a portal, a spy hole for a dark entity. The astrological slots weren't for tracking seasons. They were for timing pagan rituals. Alex Jones's Endgame took this fringe theory and broadcast it to millions. The internet did the rest. The film was ripped, re-uploaded, and shared across countless forums and fledgling social media platforms. The story of the satanic stones went viral. Before 2008, you had to be a local, a tourist, or a deep-diving researcher to even know the Guidestones existed. After Endgame, they were an international symbol of evil for a massive, energized, and angry online community. The effect on the ground in Elberton was immediate and profound. The type of visitor began to change. The curious tourists and New Age pilgrims were increasingly outnumbered by a new breed: the conspiracy crusaders. They came not to marvel, but to confront. They filmed themselves walking around the monument, delivering impassioned monologues, pointing their cameras at the inscriptions as if they were fresh bloodstains at a crime scene. They were searching for evidence, for secret symbols, for confirmation of their deepest fears. Local officials who for decades had treated the Guidestones as a strange but harmless town asset were now inundated with angry phone calls and emails from across the country, and even the world. They were accused of being complicit, of being paid-off members of the cabal, of protecting a satanic monument. The Elbert County Chamber of Commerce, which had once proudly promoted the American Stonehenge, now found itself on the defensive, trying to explain to a furious public that no, they were not part of a global plot to exterminate humanity. The vandalism also evolved. The spray-painted tags of the past, often crude and nonsensical, were replaced with messages that were targeted and ideological. Phrases like "Death to the New World Order" began appearing. Christian crosses were painted over the stones, as if to perform a public exorcism. One vandal scrawled, "I am Isis, goddess of love," attempting to reclaim the monument for a different spiritual purpose. Each act of vandalism was no longer just a random defacement. It was a volley in a culture war, a physical response to the digital battle raging online. This was the true power of the narrative Alex Jones and others had crafted. It took a set of abstract global anxieties: fear of government overreach, economic instability, cultural change, loss of faith, and gave them a physical address. It's hard to fight against globalization. It's impossible to punch the stock market. But you can drive to Elbert County, Georgia. You can stand in front of a block of granite. You can touch it, yell at it, spray paint it. The Guidestones became a focal point, a tangible enemy that could be seen and confronted. They were no longer just a mystery. They were a manifesto, a confession carved in stone. And as the 2010s wore on, the rhetoric online only grew more extreme. The stones were blamed for everything from natural disasters to political assassinations. They became a sort of dark idol, imbued with supernatural power by the very people who despised them. The war of words had successfully dehumanized the monument, turning it from a piece of public art into a symbol of pure evil. And when you convince enough people that something is the embodiment of absolute evil, you are no longer just encouraging them to disagree with it. You are giving them permission to destroy it. The online war had drawn the battle lines. The digital soldiers had been mobilized. But words on a screen and angry phone calls can only go so far. Sooner or later, someone was bound to decide that the only way to fight a monument was with more than just a message. And so, the first messages were delivered not with dynamite, but with polyurethane paint. For years, the Guidestones had been a local curiosity, a tourist stop. But as the online furor grew, they transformed into something else. A public canvas for rage and religious fervor. The attacks were sporadic at first, almost amateurish. In 2008, the stones were defaced with slogans like, "Death to the New World Order." The messages were crude, the paint was blue, and the sentiment was clear. The digital war had spilled over into the physical world. The Elberton Granite Association would clean the stones, scrubbing away the graffiti, but the ideas were harder to erase. Each act of vandalism was a victory for those who saw the monument as a symbol of evil. It was proof that they weren't alone, that others were willing to take real-world risks to make a statement. The local sheriff's office would investigate, but the culprits were ghosts. They'd strike in the dead of night on that isolated hill and vanish. Then, in 2014, came a truly bizarre act of vandalism. Someone meticulously spray-painted a strange, cryptic phrase across the top of the English-language slab. "I am Isis, goddess of love." Other stones were marked with phrases like "jam on" and numbers. It made no sense. Was it a prank? A message from a different kind of esoteric group? Or was it a deliberate attempt to confuse the narrative, to mock the very idea of conspiracy? For those who saw a globalist plot behind every shadow, this was just more noise, more deception from the enemy. But for the people of Elbert County, it was another expensive cleanup, another headache. The monument was becoming a problem. With each incident, the county installed more security. First a single camera, then more cameras covering more angles. They were trying to protect a tourist attraction, a piece of local history, but they were really trying to guard against an ideology. How do you put a fence around a belief? How does a camera stop an idea that has taken root in millions of minds? The vandals saw the cameras not as a deterrent, but as a challenge. A symbol of the surveillance state they believed the Guidestones represented. The war of words continued to escalate online, but the real turning point, the moment the threat became truly mainstream, didn't happen on a shadowy internet forum. It happened on a political debate stage. Her name was Candace Taylor. In 2022, she was a third-place Republican candidate for governor of Georgia. On the surface, her campaign was a long shot. But she wasn't just running for office. She was leading a crusade. And at the very center of that crusade was a 10-point executive order she planned to sign on day one. Her number one priority? Not the economy, not healthcare, not education. It was the demolition of the Georgia Guidestones. She didn't just oppose the monument. She declared it satanic. She called it a monument to Luciferianism and a product of a secret cabal. She adopted the language of the conspiracy forums and broadcast it with the legitimacy of a political candidate. Her campaign slogan was "Jesus, guns, and babies." And she made it clear that the Guidestones stood in opposition to all three. In one campaign video, standing defiantly in front of the monument, she declared, "I am the only candidate bold enough to stand up to the Luciferian cabal. Elect me governor of Georgia, and I will bring the satanic regime to its knees and demolish the Georgia Guidestones." This wasn't a fringe blogger anymore. This was a candidate for the highest office in the state, pointing a finger at a pile of rocks and declaring it the work of the devil. She promised to use state funds to tear it down. She promised to use heavy equipment to grind it into dust. She tapped into decades of fear and suspicion and gave it a political voice. For her supporters, she was a hero, a modern-day prophet willing to speak the truth that the mainstream media and political establishment refused to acknowledge. They saw her as divinely inspired. Taylor herself fanned these flames. In one speech, she proclaimed, "God is God all by himself. He can do anything he wants to do. That includes striking down satanic Guidestones." The implication was clear. If God chose to act, perhaps through human hands, it wasn't a crime. It was divine will. This was a profound shift. The conversation was no longer about what the Guidestones meant. The conversation was now about what to do with them. Candace Taylor had effectively given people permission to hate the monument out in the open. More than that, she had framed its destruction not as an act of vandalism, but as a righteous, even holy act. A blow against evil. a patriotic duty. She lost the primary, securing only 3.4% of the vote. But the damage was done. The idea she had championed didn't just disappear after Election Day. She had taken a fringe conspiracy theory, laundered it through a political campaign, and presented it to the public as a legitimate policy position. She had told a large group of angry, motivated people that their deepest fears were correct, and that direct action was the solution. She had, in effect, drawn a target on the Georgia Guidestones. She may not have lit the fuse herself, but she had spent months handing out matches. And so, the monument stood on that hilltop in rural Georgia, under a heavier weight than just its own granite. It now bore the weight of a failed political campaign, of a prophecy of its own destruction. The cameras watched, silent witnesses to the growing tension. Locals in Elberton grew uneasy. They'd see cars with out-of-state plates parked near the site at odd hours. The monument had always been controversial, but now it felt dangerous. It felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark. The summer of 2022 was hot and dry. The political climate was even hotter. The nation was a tinderbox of division and distrust. And in the middle of it all, on a quiet hill in Elbert County, stood this strange, silent monument to reason, a relic from a different time, bearing a message that seemed more impossible than ever. A message about uniting humanity. As the sun set on July 5, 2022, the Guidestones cast long shadows across the grass. The tourists went home. The evening traffic on Guidestone Road dwindled to nothing. The crickets began their nightly chorus. The security cameras recorded the quiet emptiness, the granite slabs glowing faintly in the moonlight. For 42 years they had weathered storms, criticism, and spray paint. They had stood against the wind and the rain, silent and immovable. They seemed permanent, eternal. But something was different about this night. The years of online rage, the political declarations, the religious condemnations, they had all been building toward a single moment. The digital war was about to become devastatingly real. Deep in the darkness of that rural Georgia night, a vehicle was moving. It traveled down the empty country roads, its headlights cutting through the blackness. And it was heading directly for the hill. The person behind the wheel wasn't carrying a can of spray paint. They weren't there to leave a message. They were there to deliver a verdict. The vehicle slowed to a stop, its engine a low rumble in the pre-dawn stillness. For a moment, nothing happened. The car just sat there, an unnatural presence on the quiet hilltop, its headlights illuminating the base of the colossal granite slabs. Then a door creaked open. A figure emerged, indistinct in the grainy, low-light security footage that was silently recording the scene. There was no hesitation. This person moved with a clear, undeniable purpose. They walked directly to the northwest corner of the monument, to the slab engraved with Swahili and Hebrew. They placed a package at its base. The entire act took less than a minute. The figure then walked calmly back to the car, got in and drove away, disappearing back into the darkness from which they came. For a few minutes, the scene returned to its silent, watchful state. The crickets resumed their chorus. The wind whispered through the Georgia pines. The stones stood, as they had for 42 years, stoic and impassive. They had endured spray paint, political screeds, and the relentless scrutiny of a suspicious world. They had become a canvas for humanity's deepest fears and wildest speculations. But they had always remained unmoved. At 4:03 a.m. on the morning of July 6, 2022, that changed forever. The security camera, which had no audio, captured a sudden violent cloud of dust and debris erupting from the base of the monument. A plume of smoke and pulverized granite shot sideways, obscuring the camera's view. A second camera, positioned further away, showed the same silent, brutal concussion. The ground itself seemed to jump. But for the people living miles away, the event was not silent. It was a deafening boom that ripped them from their sleep. A deep, resonant explosion that rattled windows and shook houses. Some thought it was a clap of thunder from a freak storm. Others, a transformer blowing or a car crash on the highway. One resident, who lived over 5 miles away, described it as a sound that shook you to your bones. No one immediately thought of the Guidestones. Why would they? The monument was a permanent fixture, a strange but accepted part of the local landscape. The first 911 calls started trickling in, reporting a loud explosion in the vicinity of Guidestone Road. When deputies from the Elbert County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene, their flashlights cut through the lingering dust and smoke to reveal a scene of utter devastation. One of the four massive standing slabs, the one bearing the 10 commandments of the New World Order in Swahili and Hebrew, was gone. It hadn't just been toppled. It had been annihilated. In its place was a pile of jagged gray rubble. Chunks of granite, some small enough to hold in your hand, others the size of car engines, were scattered across the hilltop. The central gnomon stone was damaged, and the massive capstone, which had rested atop the four slabs for 4 decades, was now fractured and precariously tilted. The monument was broken, mortally wounded. The message, delivered by an unknown person with an unknown explosive, was clear. The Georgia Guidestones were to be no more. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale, early morning light on the wreckage, the full scope of the attack became clear. This wasn't simple vandalism. This was a professional-grade demolition. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, or GBI, was called in, alongside federal agents from the ATF. The hilltop was immediately cordoned off with yellow crime scene tape. Bomb-sniffing dogs were brought in to sweep the area for any secondary devices, while investigators in white hazmat suits began the painstaking process of sifting through the debris, looking for fragments of the explosive, a timer, a detonator, any clue as to who had done this. But even as the first investigators were stepping onto the scene, the news was already exploding online. The grainy security footage was released to the public, and it went viral in a matter of hours. A clip of a silver sedan speeding away from the scene became the 21st century's Zapruder film for the conspiracy community. The internet did what the internet does best. It became a global, instantaneous, and chaotic detective agency. Within hours, the bombing of the Georgia Guidestones was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. On platforms like Reddit, 4chan, and Telegram, the speculation was frenzied. For those who had long seen the Guidestones as a monument to a sinister globalist plot, this was a moment of triumph. They saw the bomber not as a criminal, but as a hero, a patriot who had struck a blow against the forces of darkness. They celebrated the destruction as a righteous act, a fulfillment of God's will. To them, America's Stonehenge had been a satanic altar, and its destruction was an exorcism. Prominent conspiracy theorists and far-right commentators fanned the flames. Some claimed it was a divine act, that God himself had struck the monument down with a bolt of lightning, a theory quickly debunked by the clear evidence of a planted explosive. Others pointed fingers not at a lone wolf, but at their political enemies. The bombing, they claimed, was a false flag operation. It was carried out by the global elites themselves, the very people RC Christians supposedly represented. Why? To frame their opponents, to create a pretext for a crackdown on dissent, to make believers in the New World Order conspiracy look like violent domestic terrorists. Every grainy pixel of the security footage was analyzed, every shadow scrutinized. Was the car a model used by government agencies? Was the person's walk a trained gait? Then there was the other side. Those who saw the Guidestones not as an evil tablet, but as a quirky roadside attraction, a piece of folk art, or at the very least, a protected piece of private property. They saw the bombing as a terrifying escalation of the political and cultural divisions tearing the country apart. They viewed it as an act of homegrown terrorism, fueled by the same online disinformation and paranoia that had been growing for years. To them, the bomber was a fanatic, a zealot who had become so consumed by a fantasy that they decided to bring it into the real world with explosives. They argued that destroying a monument because you disagree with the words carved on it is an attack on the very idea of free speech and open debate. It was, in their eyes, a new form of book burning, but with dynamite instead of fire. Back in Elbert County, the local community was in a state of shock. For 42 years, they had been the custodians of this strange inheritance. It had brought tourists, reporters, and no small amount of controversy to their quiet corner of Georgia. But it was their controversy. It was part of their identity. The mayor of Elberton expressed his deep disappointment and anger. The Elberton Granite Association, which had helped build the monument, condemned the act. For them, this wasn't about the New World Order or global conspiracies. It was about the destruction of a unique and masterfully crafted granite structure, a testament to their town's claim as the granite capital of the world. The GBI released the photos of the suspect vehicle, a silver sedan, and asked for the public's help. The investigation was now in full swing. They had a time of the crime. They had video of a suspect in a vehicle. They had the physical evidence of the explosion itself. They were confident they would find the person responsible. But as investigators worked under the hot Georgia sun, trying to piece together the events of that violent morning, a different set of conversations was happening behind closed doors. County officials were assessing the scene not just as a crime, but as a liability. The monument was severely compromised. The massive multi-ton capstone was cracked and unstable, teetering over the remaining slabs. The central pillar was weakened. The entire structure was now a safety hazard. The cost to repair it, if it was even possible, would be astronomical. And even if they could repair it, what was to stop someone from coming back and trying again? The Guidestones had become a lightning rod, and the lightning had finally struck. The bomber had delivered their verdict in a cloud of smoke and shattered granite. But the story wasn't over. In fact, the most shocking and controversial act was yet to come. As the world debated who blew up the Georgia Guidestones and why, the fate of the remaining stones was being decided. And that decision would be swift, final, and would ensure that America's Stonehenge would vanish from the earth forever. The morning of July 6, 2022, dawned on a scene of desecration. For 42 years, the Georgia Guidestones had greeted the sunrise. Now, one of its massive granite slabs lay in rubble, its English and Spanish inscriptions shattered into 1,000 pieces. The air, thick with Georgia humidity, now carried the faint, acrid smell of explosives. The initial shockwave of the blast was quickly replaced by a digital one, as images of the damaged monument spread across the globe like wildfire. For a few brief hours, the world stared at this wounded giant, a symbol of order now thrown into chaos. It was a crime scene. A piece of American history, however controversial, had been attacked. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was on the case, and everyone assumed a lengthy, careful forensic analysis would begin. They assumed wrong. Before the dust had even truly settled, before forensic teams could properly cordon off the area and begin the painstaking process of collecting evidence, a decision was made. A decision so swift, it stunned observers and immediately became the new focal point of the entire mystery. Heavy machinery, yellow excavators and bulldozers rumbled toward the hill. Their purpose was not to assist in an investigation. It was to finish the job. The official statement from the Elbert County Road Department was simple, direct, and, to many, deeply unsatisfying. They claimed the remaining, towering granite slabs were structurally unstable after the blast. For safety reasons, they had to be demolished immediately. And just like that, with the sun still high in the sky on that very same day, the destruction began. A massive excavator, its steel claw looking like a prehistoric predator, pushed against one of the standing stones. For a moment, the granite monolith, which had withstood decades of storms and speculation, resisted. Then, with a deep groan that seemed to echo across the fields, it toppled over, crashing to the earth with a percussive boom that signaled the end of an era. The remaining stones followed. One by one, they were brought down, the carefully crafted inscriptions and astronomical alignments rendered meaningless as they were reduced to a pile of gray rubble. Within hours, America's Stonehenge was gone, erased. The entire structure, which had taken months of precision engineering to erect, was dismantled and hauled away in a fraction of a day. The speed was breathtaking, and to a world already steeped in conspiracy, it wasn't just fast, it was suspicious. The justification of safety concerns was immediately scrutinized. Couldn't the area simply be secured? Couldn't engineers have been brought in to assess the true structural integrity? Why the frantic, almost desperate, rush to wipe the slate clean? The answer, for many, was obvious. They were destroying the evidence. This theory exploded online with more force than the original bomb. A proper investigation would have required examining every inch of the remaining stones. They would look for shrapnel, for residue from the explosive device, for clues left behind by the perpetrator. By pulverizing the entire site, the authorities had, intentionally or not, potentially compromised the single most important source of physical evidence. It was like a homicide detective arriving at a crime scene only to find the entire house had been bulldozed. This gave birth to a darker, more insidious theory, that the demolition wasn't a panic safety measure, but a calculated, deliberate act. That the bombing itself was merely a pretext, the perfect excuse for certain influential people to get rid of a monument they had long considered a blight. Had the growing local and national hostility, fanned by figures like Candace Taylor, finally reached a breaking point? Did someone in a position of power see the explosion not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity? an opportunity to remove a controversial landmark without the messy, protracted legal and public battles that would have been required otherwise. It was a chilling thought that the bombing and the demolition were two parts of the same plan, a coordinated effort to remove the Guidestones from both the physical landscape and the public discourse. But as the granite slabs were being hauled away to an undisclosed location, another mystery, one that had been buried for decades, was unearthed. Literally, the time capsule. One of the inscriptions on the Guidestones mentioned a time capsule, buried 6 feet below the marker. The inscription read, "To be opened on," followed by a blank space, a perpetually unanswered question. For 42 years, people had wondered what R.C. Christian and his anonymous group had deemed important enough to preserve for a future, unknown generation. Was it a more detailed explanation of their philosophy? The true identities of the sponsors? A warning? A message of hope? The demolition of the monument provided the first and only opportunity to solve this mystery. As the excavators dug up the foundation, the world watched and waited. What would they find? News crews reported that officials were indeed digging for the capsule. The anticipation was immense. And then, nothing. The official word came down. There was no time capsule. The hole was empty. Elbert County officials stated that after digging down, they found nothing but dirt and concrete. This announcement was met with a tidal wave of disbelief. For conspiracy theorists, this was the smoking gun. Of course, they would say they found nothing. If the true purpose of the Guidestones was as sinister as they believed, the contents of that capsule could have been damning. Perhaps it contained documents proving a link to a shadowy global elite, or detailed plans for the New World Order, the 10 Guides seemed to hint at. The empty hole story was seen as a cover-up of epic proportions. A different theory suggested that the capsule had been real, but that someone had secretly removed it long ago, perhaps even R.C. Christian himself or his descendants, once they realized the monument was becoming a lightning rod for controversy. And yet another theory was simpler, and perhaps even more in line with the trickster nature of the monument's creator, that the time capsule was the ultimate prank, that R.C. Christian had included the inscription knowing that it would fuel decades of speculation. A final, clever bit of misdirection to keep people guessing forever. The empty hole wasn't a cover-up. It was the punchline to a 42-year-old joke. Whatever the truth, the mystery of the time capsule was now sealed forever. Another unanswered question in a story full of them. The physical monument was gone, but its destruction ensured its immortality. It was no longer just a peculiar roadside attraction in rural Georgia. It had become a martyr. For those who saw it as a symbol of globalist evil, its destruction was a righteous victory, a sign that their fight was just. For those who saw it as a quirky piece of folk art or a plea for rational thinking, its demolition was a tragic testament to the destructive power of ignorance and fear. The Guidestones had become a digital ghost, haunting the internet, its image and its 10 commandments shared and debated more furiously in death than they ever were in life. The county officials may have thought that by removing the stones, they were removing the problem. They couldn't have been more wrong. They had simply transformed the monument from a thing of granite and concrete into an idea, and an idea is much harder to destroy. The site was now a flat patch of red Georgia clay, but the questions only grew louder. Who placed the bomb? Why was the evidence so quickly destroyed? What was or wasn't in the time capsule? The authorities had cleared the land, but they could not clear the air of suspicion. And while the public debated these new mysteries, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was quietly working on the original one. They had lost their crime scene, but they still had a crucial piece of evidence the bulldozers couldn't touch: surveillance footage. And on that footage, a shadowy figure could be seen approaching the stones in the dead of night, leaving behind a package, and running off into the darkness, just moments before the world would be reminded of the Georgia Guidestones forever. The manhunt was on. The blast echoed across the quiet farmland of Elbert County, a thunderclap on a clear night. But the sound that truly reverberated across the globe was digital. Before the sun had even risen, before the first local news van had arrived, the Georgia Guidestones were trending. The grainy surveillance footage, released by investigators in a desperate plea for public help, became an instant viral sensation. It was played, paused, zoomed in on, and analyzed by millions of amateur detectives from their keyboards. Every pixel was scrutinized. The shadowy figure, the package, the silver sedan speeding away into the darkness. These weren't just clues in a police investigation. They were the opening frames of a global mystery. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, took the lead. They were dealing with a domestic terrorism event. The site was cordoned off, a sprawling crime scene of granite dust and twisted rebar. Bomb squads carefully sifted through the rubble, looking for fragments of the explosive device, trying to determine its signature. Was it a sophisticated military-grade explosive or a crude homemade bomb? The answer would speak volumes about the perpetrator. Was this the work of a lone, disturbed individual or a well-funded, organized group? While investigators in hazmat suits collected evidence under the hot Georgia sun, the internet was a wildfire of speculation. The two competing narratives that had defined the Guidestones for decades went into overdrive. On one side, you had those who saw the bombing as a tragedy, an act of senseless vandalism against a unique piece of folk art and a local landmark. They mourned the loss, sharing old photos of the stones standing tall against the sky. On the other side, there was celebration. To them, this wasn't destruction, it was liberation. It was a righteous blow against a monument they saw as a Ten Commandments-style edict for a satanic New World Order. On platforms like Telegram and Gab, users hailed the bomber as a hero, a patriot striking back against globalist elites. The GBI released more footage. It showed a silver sedan pulling up near the monument, and later, speeding away from the scene after the explosion. Immediately, the car became the Zapruder film of the Guidestones mystery. Online forums dedicated to vehicle identification went to work. Was it a Chrysler Sebring? A Dodge Stratus? A Hyundai Elantra? Users compared tail light configurations, the curve of the roofline, the placement of the side mirrors. They argued ferociously over model years. The hope was that if they could identify the car, they could narrow the search. But it was a common, anonymous vehicle, one of thousands on the road. A ghost. The investigation on the ground was methodical, but frustrating. The bomber had chosen their time well. The remote location, the cover of darkness, it was a plan designed to leave few witnesses and a cold trail. Investigators pulled cell tower data, hoping to find a phone that pinged in the area around the time of the explosion, and then traveled along the escape route. They checked local motels and scoured lists of individuals known to law enforcement for extremist views. They re-interviewed everyone who had been publicly vocal against the stones, including political candidates who had called for their demolition. But a public call to tear something down is a world away from a secret plot to blow it up. The nature of the explosive itself provided few leads. It was determined to be a relatively common, commercially available compound, but expertly placed. The bomber knew exactly where to put the device to cause maximum damage, to shatter the granite slab containing the English and Spanish inscriptions. This suggested a degree of planning and knowledge that went beyond simple rage. This was a targeted, almost surgical strike. Meanwhile, the conspiracy theories mutated. One popular theory, amplified by QAnon influencers, claimed it was a false flag. They argued that the global elites, the very people who supposedly built the Guidestones, had destroyed their own monument. Why? To create a crisis, to blame their political opponents, and to justify a crackdown on dissent. They pointed to the fact that just hours after the initial bombing, authorities decided to demolish the entire remaining structure for safety reasons. To them, this was suspicious. Why tear it down so quickly? Wasn't that destroying evidence? The official explanation was that the remaining stones were structurally unstable and posed a danger to the public and to the investigators working on site. But to a mind primed for conspiracy, this was a cover-up in plain sight. The elites were wiping the slate clean, erasing their own demonic message before the world truly awakened. Another set of theories focused on the timing. The bombing happened on July 6th. Numerologists and occult researchers had a field day. The date was exactly 2 years, 2 months, and 2 weeks after the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. Others pointed out that the day of the bombing, July 6th, when the numbers are added together, 7 plus 6 equals 13, a number steeped in occult significance. And if you looked at the date in a different format, it was the 187th day of the year. In the Bible, Psalm 18 verse 7 reads, "Then the earth shook and trembled, the foundations of the hills moved and were shaken because he was angry." For believers, this wasn't a coincidence. It was a sign. This wasn't just a bombing. It was an act of God, carried out by a human hand. The GBI, however, wasn't looking for divine intervention. They were looking for a human being. They had a grainy image of a person, a blurry video of a car, and the chemical residue of an explosive. It wasn't much to go on. The bomber had been careful. They left no fingerprints, no DNA that could be easily recovered from the rubble. They used a common car and likely a stolen license plate. In the digital age, they had somehow managed to become a ghost. Days turned into weeks. The initial media frenzy died down. The rubble of the Guidestones was quietly cleared away, leaving nothing but a red dirt patch and a small granite plaque commemorating the monument. It seemed the mystery might remain unsolved. Another piece of strange American folklore. The bomber, whoever they were, had seemingly gotten away with it. They had erased the Guidestones from the landscape and vanished back into the shadows from which they came. The online sleuths moved on to the next outrage, the next mystery. The GBI went quiet, releasing no new information. The trail, it appeared to everyone, had gone completely cold. But behind the scenes, the hunt was more intense than ever. Investigators were piecing together a different kind of puzzle, one that didn't rely on grainy video or occult numerology. They were building a profile. They believed their suspect was likely a local, or at least someone with intimate knowledge of the area. Someone who knew the backroads, the lack of surveillance, the perfect time to strike. They were likely driven by a powerful, all-consuming ideology, a belief system that framed the Guidestones not as stone, but as a symbol of pure evil that had to be eradicated. They were looking for someone who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. And as they sifted through terabytes of data and hours of interviews, a name began to surface. A person who had not only expressed a deep-seated hatred for the Guidestones, but who also had a history with explosives, and whose movements on the night of the bombing couldn't be accounted for. The ghost was about to get a face. His name was Michael S. Stull, a man from Elberton, Georgia, the very town that had hosted the Granite Enigma for over 40 years. He wasn't some shadowy operative from a foreign power or a high-ranking member of a secret society. He was, on the surface, just a man. But investigators would soon uncover that beneath that surface was a roiling cauldron of extremist belief, paranoia, and a very specific, very dangerous set of skills. Stull was a United States Marine Corps veteran. Not just any veteran, but one trained in explosive ordnance disposal, or EOD. He knew bombs. He knew how to build them, how to handle them, and how to use them to achieve maximum destructive effect. The ghost now had a face, and that face belonged to an expert in the very weapon used to attack the Guidestones. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI, had been drinking from a fire hose of tips and leads. Thousands of emails, calls, and social media DMs poured in. Most were dead ends. People pointing fingers at ex-spouses, strange neighbors, or public figures they disliked. But amidst the noise, a pattern began to emerge. Several tips, all independent of each other, pointed to one name: Michael Stull. They painted a picture of a man who had become consumed by the monument in his own backyard. A man who spoke of it not as a tourist attraction, but as a satanic altar, a blasphemous testament to a globalist cabal bent on enslaving humanity. To his online followers and in local circles, Stull's obsession was no secret. He was a vocal proponent of the QAnon conspiracy theory, and for him, the Guidestones were a physical manifestation of everything he fought against. He saw the 10 Commandments of the Stones not as guidance for a post-apocalyptic world, but as the literal commandments of the Antichrist. Maintaining humanity under 500 million wasn't a suggestion for sustainability. It was a call for a genocidal purge. Guiding reproduction wisely wasn't about family planning. It was about a Luciferian eugenics program. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was living in the end times, and that the Georgia Guidestones were a high-value target in a holy war against evil. Investigators began digging into his digital life, and what they found was a breadcrumb trail leading directly to the morning of July 6th. For months, even years, Stull had been posting vitriolic condemnations of the monument. He called for its destruction, framing it as a righteous act, a duty for any true patriot or believer. He saw himself not as a vandal, but as a soldier of God, chosen to smite a graven image. The rhetoric was chilling, but it was still just words. The GBI needed more. They needed to connect the keyboard warrior to the man in the silver sedan. They went back to the grainy surveillance footage. The silver car. They cross-referenced vehicle registration records for known associates and persons of interest in the Elberton area. And there it was. A silver sedan, registered to a family member of Michael S. Stull. It was a match. The digital world and the physical world were beginning to collide. The GBI then secured warrants for Stull's cell phone records. This is where the case cracked wide open. Using cell tower triangulation, they could paint a ghostly map of his movements. And on the night of July 5th into the early morning of July 6th, Stull's phone wasn't silent at his home. It was moving. It traveled from his residence directly to the area of the Georgia Guidestones. It remained there during the time frame of the explosion, and then it traveled back. The data was damning. It placed him at the scene of the crime at the exact time of the crime. He had the motive, a deep fanatical religious and political hatred for the monument. He had the means, a highly specialized military training in explosives. And now they had the evidence placing him at the location. The ghost wasn't just a face anymore. It was a man in a specific car, holding a specific phone, standing on a specific patch of Georgia soil as he allegedly prepared to blow a hole in the sky. The GBI assembled a tactical team. On the evening of July 6th, just hours after the last of the Guidestones had been bulldozed into rubble, they descended on Stull's home in Elberton. The man who believed he was fighting a secret war against a global cabal suddenly found himself in a very real confrontation with local and state law enforcement. The operation was swift. Stull was taken into custody without a fight. As officers searched his home, they found what they described as further evidence linking him to the bombing, though the specifics were not immediately made public. News of the arrest spread like wildfire. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. It wasn't a global conspiracy. It wasn't a publicity stunt by the monument's creators. It was one man, allegedly driven by a cocktail of religious fervor and online conspiracy theories, who decided to take matters into his own hands. The world's most mysterious monument was seemingly brought down by a local man who thought he was doing God's work. He was charged with multiple felonies, including arson and possession of an explosive device. The case appeared open and shut. The district attorney was confident. The evidence was strong. A trial would be a formality, a public airing of the facts before a conviction that seemed all but certain. The public waited for the court date, ready to hear the full story, to finally understand the why from the man himself. But Michael S. Stull would never get his day in court. He would never testify. He would never explain his actions to a jury or to the world, because shortly after his arrest, while out on bond and awaiting trial, the final shocking chapter of his story was written. On a quiet Friday, law enforcement was called to a home in Elberton. They arrived to find a body. Stull had taken his own life. The prime and only suspect in the bombing of the Georgia Guidestones was dead. The man who investigators were certain held all the answers had chosen to take them with him to the grave. The case was officially closed, but for many, the mystery had just been blown wide open once again. The bomber was gone, but the silence he left behind was louder than any explosion. And so, the official narrative came to a neat, if tragic, conclusion. A troubled man consumed by delusion acted alone. Case closed. But this clean, simple answer felt hollow, unsatisfying. It was like trying to patch a canyon with a Band-Aid. Because the destruction of the Georgia Guidestones wasn't just about one man and one bomb. It was the chaotic final chapter in a story that had always been about the collision of grand ideas and human fallibility. The bomber may have silenced the stones, but he amplified their legend to a deafening roar. In the immediate aftermath, the site in Elbert County became a strange modern ruin. The remaining upright slab, defiant but alone, was deemed a safety hazard. On the evening of July 6, 2022, the same day the monument was attacked, county officials brought in an excavator and tore down what was left. The great granite slabs, which had been so meticulously crafted to withstand the apocalypse, were unceremoniously reduced to a pile of rubble. The county announced that for safety reasons, the remains would be removed and the site returned to what it once was, an empty field. The decision was swift and final. There would be no rebuilding. The gift that R.C. Christian had bestowed upon Elbert County, a gift that brought tourists fame and endless controversy, was being returned to sender in a sense. The monument had become too heavy a burden to bear. It had attracted not just curious onlookers, but a darkness that finally manifested in explosive violence. For the local community, the destruction was the end of a landmark, but also perhaps a relief. The strange energy that had surrounded that hilltop for over 4 decades had finally been discharged. But what did we actually lose? Was it a benign if eccentric piece of public art? Or was it the headquarters for a globalist conspiracy, as its destroyer believed? The truth is, the Guidestones were always a mirror. People didn't see what was written in the stone. They saw a reflection of their own deepest hopes and fears for the future of humanity. Think about the 10 guides themselves, now scattered in 1,000 pieces. Maintain humanity under 500 million. To a survivalist fearing overpopulation and resource collapse, this was pragmatic, even necessary advice. To a devout Christian or a human rights advocate, it was a chilling call for eugenics, a mandate for mass death that echoed the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. To a New Age thinker, this might suggest spiritual and genetic enlightenment. To a skeptic, it sounded like something straight out of a dystopian novel, a world of state-controlled breeding programs. Unite humanity with a living new language. A beautiful utopian ideal of a world without barriers? Or a terrifying step towards a monolithic global government? The new world order that so many feared, where individual cultures are erased in favor of a single homogeneous entity? Rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. This is the guide that sits at the very heart of the conflict. It's a call for an age of reason, a plea to set aside the dogmas that have driven humanity to war for millennia. But to the man who blew it up, this wasn't a call for reason. It was a declaration of war against faith itself. It was a command to place human logic above the word of God. In his mind, he wasn't destroying a monument. He was striking a blow against a satanic creed etched in granite. This is the ultimate legacy of the Georgia Guidestones. They were a perfect, unmoving Rorschach test. What you saw in them said more about you than it did about R.C. Christian or his mysterious group. And in their destruction, we see the most profound and tragic irony of all. The monument was built as a guide for humanity to survive a great catastrophe, a set of principles to rebuild civilization. Yet it was destroyed by the very forces it seemed to warn against: extremism, division, and the inability to rule passion with tempered reason. The bomber, in his fervent belief that he was saving the world, may have inadvertently proven the monument's central thesis, that our own irrationality is our greatest threat. The Guidestones were meant to speak to a future generation, a quiet, stoic message of hope and caution for the survivors of a world-ending event. Instead, their loudest message was delivered to us, right here and now, in their violent end. Their destruction tells a story about modern America, a story of how easily shared realities can fracture, how conspiracy can curdle into action, and how a mystery can become a target. And what of the mysteries that started it all? They remain more potent than ever. We still don't know who R.C. Christian truly was. Was he a wealthy eccentric, the front for a secret society like the Rosicrucians? Was he a pragmatist, a prophet, or a provocateur? His identity is a secret that likely died with him, his motivations forever locked away. The specific meaning of the time capsule, the orientation of the astronomical features, the true purpose behind the 10 guides, all of it is now left entirely to speculation. The primary document has been destroyed. All we have left are copies, memories, and interpretations. The bomber, the one person who could have explained why he felt compelled to take such drastic action, chose to take his own life, leaving behind only a burned-out car and a cloud of unanswered questions. His motives, like R.C. Christian's, are now buried. Another layer in the monument's complex mythology. The official story is that he was a lone, disturbed individual. But for many, he remains a folk hero in the digital shadows, a soldier in a cosmic war against evil, his actions celebrated in the same forums where the Guidestones were condemned. Today, if you visit the hill in Elbert County, you'll find nothing. The ground is level. The grass is growing back. There is no plaque, no memorial, no pile of rubble. There is only absence. But that absence is not empty. It's a monument in itself. It's a monument to a mystery that was so powerful, some felt it had to be physically erased from the earth. It stands as a testament to the fact that an idea, once carved into stone and into the public consciousness, can never truly be destroyed. It only transforms. The Georgia Guidestones are gone. America's Stonehenge has fallen. But the story is far from over. It has simply moved from the physical world to the realm of modern legend. It exists now in countless documentaries, in late-night arguments, in whispered theories, and in the quiet, empty space on a Georgia hilltop. The granite has been pulverized, But the questions it posed about humanity, governance, and our ultimate destiny still hang in the air, heavier and more relevant than ever. The stones no longer stand, but the shadow they cast is now permanent.